Our coverage tonight on Duke Energy's proposal to increase the rate customers pay by 18%.
Many of those customers made it very clear at a public hearing tonight they do not support the company's plan. WECT's Delaney Tarpley sat in on the virtual hearing hosted by the State Utilities Commission. Delaney, did you hear any member of the public support Duke Energy at the hearing?
No, Fran, I did not. Many people said an 18% increase would be devastating to their financial situations. The Utilities Commission has to approve Duke's request, but everyone who spoke out tonight urged the commission to say no.
These increases will negatively impact my life.
Those words echoed by many people in front of North Carolina Utilities Commissioners Wednesday night. Customers who called into the hearing urged the board to deny Duke Energy's request to raise rates by 18%.
This 18.5% increase is just not unaffordable. It is predatory for those on fixed income.
The proposed 18% hike would be spread across 2 years. Duke Energy is requesting a 14% increase in 2027 and another 4% in 2028. The timeline of the increase doesn't make customers feel any better.
From a consumer perspective, this is simply too much too fast.
This is just one of several hearings planned by the commission to hear what the public thinks of Duke Energy's proposal. More than 70,000 North and South Carolina residents have also signed a petition calling for an audit of Duke Energy's billing practices.
We certainly understand concerns around cost. We're all facing it in all aspects of our lives. We ourselves have seen increased costs in some of the staple equipment that we use every day.
Duke Energy spokesperson Jeff Brooks told us earlier in the week, though, Duke Energy is one of the most regulated companies in the country.
You think about the utility industry. We can't set our own prices. Those are set by our regulators. We're subject to reporting regularly the types of operations that we have, the costs we incur, how those costs are being shared with customers.
To one Shallotte woman who spoke during the hearing, the rate increase could force her and others to make difficult decisions.
When utility bills spike, it isn't just a line item. It is often a choice between medicine and lights, between a warm home and a full pantry.
The Utilities Commission is expected to make a decision on Duke Energy's rate increase request by this fall. Fran.
Delaney, are there any more of these hearings planned where the public can speak out about this proposed increase?
Yeah, Fran, I did see a few more hearings scheduled. However, none are in our immediate area. I have the ones that are scheduled posted right now inside this story over on our website.
Okay, good. Thanks so much, Delaney.